Get started. I want to welcome our two distinguished panelists, Dr. Josef Joffe, an old friend of mine from Hamburg and other places, and a newer friend, Annika Hernroth-Rothstein, for what I hope is going to be a lively give and take, including with questions from our audience, which they should feel free to use the chat or Q&A function to populate, about a subject that is could not be more timely or more important, which is the future of the Jewish community in Europe and the future of the Jewish community in the United States. Annika, in the pages of the most recent issue of SAPIR, our third issue, you wrote a really luminous essay on the topic "Two Weddings and a Sorrowful Wife," a headline I'd like you to explain in a moment on the subject of the grim future of European Jewry as you see that future. And Joe, you have a really sparkling essay in the latest edition of Commentary magazine, where you see, despite clouds on the proverbial clouds on the horizon, actually some reasons for optimism about the future of Jews in the United States. But I'd like to begin, because both of you are so well-versed in the life of European Jewry. I'd like to begin by talking about this subject, which is what seems to be the steady erosion of Jewish life in its former heartland of Europe. Annika, you are a Swede. You kind of grew up between the shores of, I guess, the Baltic and the shores of the Mediterranean. Is there any reason for any form of optimism about what remains for European Jewry, or is the future of European Jews going to be elsewhere?
I think there's reason for optimism. I think even I mentioned in my piece that what happens with the remnants of the Jewish community, at least as I described it in Sweden and elsewhere, that you either completely assimilate or you turn Orthodox. And from my perspective, there is a core group, and I see this in Sweden in particular, where if you choose, despite the hardship, to remain Jewish, meaning remain observantly Jewish, then you kind of isolate yourself. You know, I'm a proponent, and I describe this in my book as well, for sort of the return to the shtetl. That I don't think shtetl life is a bad life. That I truly believe that good fences make good neighbors, in the sense that, and we're in the middle, you know, in the beginning of Hanukkah, of Jewish identity, and some would say Jewish extremism. And I really believe that the remnants of Jewish life in Europe will be a more Orthodox one. And that this is, for me, this is the lights at the end of the tunnel. That the Jewish community that remains will be strong, because we've been tried and tested. And we are constantly being tried and tested. So, you know, in my community where, you know, I don't live mostly in Sweden anymore. I live in West Africa partly. But my home community in Sweden is turning Orthodox. The younger population is turning Orthodox and making very difficult choices, as I describe in my piece, to find, you know, a Jewish spouse, to, like myself, when I'm in Sweden, I can't get kosher meat because it's outlawed in Sweden, but I order it from Belgium. You know, we make these choices that affirm our Jewish identity. And because we have to make those choices, in a way, we're luckier than our American counterparts, because every piece of our life means having to choose Jewish, yes or no. So in the choices that I make every day, I choose to be Jewish in the everyday things, just because Europe makes it so difficult for me. So for me, that's That's a good thing. That's the positive end of or part of this trial that we're being put through.
Joe, I want to ask you, obviously I want to get to your essay on the future of American Jewry, but I just want to take advantage of the fact that much of your life has been spent in Europe, in Germany. Do you feel the same way from a German perspective? Is there a future, a non-Orthodox future for European Jewry, at least German European Jewry?
Well, let's start with the numbers first. The growth of the Jewish community in Europe ended somewhere in the 90s because that was the end of Jewish emigration to Europe from Russia. So that source has dried up. And now if we look at the demographics, you have very, very low birth rates. Take the German example, you simply have more deaths per year than you have birth. So in terms of numbers, strictly numbers, the future doesn't look that great. I agree with Annika that the stronghold of Judaism has become again orthodoxy. My problem with this is that the great moments of Jewish history in Europe, which begins essentially after the French Revolution and continues with emancipation, that was not driven by orthodoxy. It was driven by Jews moving into the mainstream of society and racking up enormous achievements in the sciences, in the arts, in theater, cabaret, if you wish, and Jews were at the forefront of intellectual achievement. Just one number, in between the 1870 and 1933, 1/3 of Germany's Nobel Prize winners were Jews. So I think there is a trade-off here. Yes, we can maintain orthodoxy, and as Annika said, we can withdraw into the shtetl with its strong walls, but I don't see how that can reenact or revive that great moment in Jewish history in the late 19th and early 20th century. Declining numbers are perhaps the most dramatic indication. Where are they going? Well, most of them are going to the grave, if you wish, and the rest is departing for Britain, departing for the United States, and or to Israel from France. So in that respect, I'm none too sanguine. But as we know from Jewish history over the last 2,000 years, those ornery Jews always have a way to bounce back.
Annika, let me push you on this a little bit. I mean, you just mentioned you're not living, I assume for personal reasons, you're not living anymore in Europe. Other than being forced to make consciously Jewish choices in order to remain an observant Jew or even a semi-observant Jew in Europe, is there any argument for staying? I mean, why would anyone, other than the idea that, well, Jews have been in exile in these communities for sometimes 2,000 years, if not more, why not move to pastures where you can choose between, say, an Orthodox or a non-Orthodox Jewish life?
Well, I would say this is one of the most complicated questions for me personally, because I usually say, I go back 3 generations in Sweden, which a lot of Jews do in Europe. We have strong bonds, deep roots.
Where were you before? Where was your family before Sweden?
Germany and Russia, Greater Russia.
Yeah,
let's say.
The old story.
Yeah.
That's the old story.
Yeah, the old story. The first pogrom Jews. So what I would say is that, I have, and I say in my piece as well, that I have a sense of paradise lost when I look at Sweden today, because I have great love for Europe. And I also, I spent 2 years traveling around Jewish communities in a book literally called Exile. And there I speak about the value of having these identities outside of Israel. I'm a Zionist, but also a diaspora proponent, in the sense that I believe that we hold these dual identities, and they're very, very important. But we're now in conflict with Europe. If we speak about Europe specifically, we're in conflict with Europe, not because we have a loss of identity, but because Europe has a loss of identity. And the reason that I believe in Sweden and in a lot of Western Europe, they hate us so much, and why we see such rise in anti-Semitism, is because we hold firm to who we are, and Europe is struggling with itself, struggling with its sense of self. And we are the example of everything that they are scared of. National identity, religious identity, us saying we don't want to be like you. All of these things are things that Europe is scared of. So you asked me, what's the reason to stay? Well, it's not that easy to leave. A lot of us, I grew up in a Jewish community where we had these conversations every Shabbos. Do we want to move to Israel and start over again? And a lot of us are very European, by the way. And I never know how European I am until I get to Israel. It's not easy. A lot of us, we have to be honest about, my friend usually says, a lot of us have the King David experience when we get to Israel. We're not fully ready for the full Israeli, Olim experience. It's difficult. And we have family there, and we have roots. So what is the reason to stay? Maybe to fight because it's right. And I fight with my Israeli friends about this all the time. They say, give it up, leave. What's the point? Why would you fight to stay somewhere where everybody hates you?
Can I press Joe on this? Because this is an interesting subject in terms of Jewish European politics. You will look to many, particularly assimilated Jews in France, Germany, Great Britain, and they'll talk about a country like Hungary with horror because of the strongman tendencies of the Orban government, its illiberal instincts on many subjects, its hostility towards immigrants from the Middle East and so on. Turns out when you talk to Hungarian Jews, they feel actually quite comfortable in Hungary. They feel that the community is honored and protected as it never was. And so, Joe, will you say a word about this kind of uncomfortable relationship between the kind of new European nationalism represented by Hungary and the position of the Jews in Europe?
I don't know that much about Hungary. All I know is that the Hungarian one is one of the largest Jewish communities, still is in Europe. What I like to approach this obliquely, if I may. What we have today that distinguishes the current period from the past is that Jews are a very strongly protected minority when it comes to official policy. There isn't one country in the Western world, I can't speak about Hungary, which doesn't exert itself on the official governmental level to protect and advance Jewish life. That's the good part, because for several centuries in the past, anti-Semitism was both a societal and an officially sanctioned hatred. Having said that, the protection, official protection, by the way, which is of course rooted in the experience of the Holocaust, has to compete I don't mean this in a polemical sense, with the Islamization of Europe. I mean, that is the group that is growing very, very fast. And so there's a problem which stems from the fact that official opinion, published opinion, is extremely, extremely cautious in criticizing, condemning, what have you, the rampant anti-Semitism, which dresses up as anti-Zionism in Europe. As between those two things, those two forces, the pro-Jewish and the anti-Jewish, that Jews will have to make a living. I agree. If you just look at things on the individual level, Jews do well, Jews flourish, but they would be very, very stupid if they went to certain sections of Stockholm or Berlin or Paris wearing Jewish symbols. And that's where we are. Now, do you have to emigrate as a result? Well, Jews have experienced worse than that. And so they hide their Magen David, right? And they don't wear their skull cap. But having said that, the upshot is it's not a very, very happy or reassuring existence. If you say, yes, well, the official Sweden, official Germany, official Britain is all for us, but alas, what's happening in society is a growing menace to Jews. And those are the two forces between which Jews are being squeezed. Will they emigrate to Israel? I think Annika is right. I mean, these are European Jews, and they're not necessarily made ideal candidates for the hurly-burly of Israel. By the way, which, and I'll end on this one, Israel used to be a European country.
Yeah.
It is now a kind of American country. It is America. You're laughing.
Well, I'm laughing.
A little bit, yeah.
I'm laughing because it's partly America and partly the Middle East. It's a mixture. But Annika, I'd like to
Could you
touch on something that Joe said, which is your essay seemed to suggest that the problem of Jewry in modern day Europe is not primarily a function of its Islamization, as Joe just put it. Am I reading you right? If there wasn't if there weren't large Islamic, or I should say Islamist populations in Malmo, Stockholm, Berlin, and so on, how significantly different would do you think the position of European Jews would be today?
Oh, significant. I will say, because I agree with Joseph in the sense that, and it touches something in me, because he describes, we always have a sense, or me and my friends at least have a sense of, we fight for the next generation, but we don't fully enjoy our own, in the sense that we feel that as Jews in Europe, it's our responsibility to stay and fight the good fights, to make sure that we fight the anti-Semitism. We go to war, basically. That existing is a statement. Existing as Jews, as observant Jews, is an act of aggression. And it's, in plain terms, it's exhausting, right? So of course, sometimes when I go to New York, or to Jerusalem or wherever, it's restful. You breathe, you feel safe, you have a different sense of security in life, and can just enjoy yourself as a normal person. Whereas when I step out in the world in Europe, I feel that I step out as a Jew, because I make a point. Also because I'm, as my friends say, a professional Jew, in the sense that I make a point of not taking off my Magen David or explicitly expressing that I'm a Jew, and that is going to war in a sense. But as far as the issue of Islam in Europe, it's a cause of fear every day. And it's almost a scary thing to say, because I understand how it's difficult politically to say it, and you're somehow pigeonholed when you speak about it. But it's a cause of fear. I have 2 teenage sons, and I'm worried for them stepping out in Stockholm today. I make a point of not having them wear kippot, because it's not worth it to me. I can fight and I can take the risk, but am I willing to have my children take the risk? No, of course not. And it's a huge issue because they are politically protected. Islamists in Europe are politically protected.
Yes, yes.
Because
yes.
it's the taboo subject that we dare not speak its name. And that's, there recently was a book, that why people love dead Jews. In Europe, they're very
Yes, the great
comfortable
Dara
talking
Horn.
about, yes, an amazing book, an amazing author. In Europe, they're very comfortable talking about the Holocaust. And I usually say that the only time of year that I see full support for the Jewish community in Sweden is on UN's Holocaust Memorial Day, when they come to synagogue and they bow their head and they're very solemn and they talk about support of the Jews. But then every other day of the year, when we want kosher meat, or we want to be able to go daven, or we want to be able to just send our kids out visibly Jewish, there is no support for us. And much of that has to do with the fact that they do not accept another enemy if it's not a Nazi. It's not acceptable to speak about. And that is a plague of Europe today. And that is a fight that I believe is lost to us. That I understand that, yes.
Let me switch continents now, because I want to get also to Joe's wonderful essay. I mean, you've described Europe as a place where it's a constant struggle to be a Jew. America is a place where it's no struggle at all to be a Jew. And as a result, by some, it's also possible to imagine there's no future for the Jews precisely for the opposite reason. It's so easy to, proclaim that you're Jewish and not necessarily observe anything, and not even be aware that it's Hanukkah. And that is the alternative existentialist or existential threat to Jewish life. But Joe, you came down, despite some concerns, as an optimist about the American Jewish future. And I'd like to hear you lay out your reasons. I'm not so optimistic as you are.
Well, when you don't know what the future is going to be like, you go into history, right? And for me, there are three historical facts that make the United States different from any other Western country. It is different in the sense that it is from even before the founding, a kind of pro-Jewish country. And I start out with a bunch of Brazilian Jews escaping the Inquisition, arriving in New Amsterdam, today better known as New York, asking for asylum. And there was Peter Stuyvesant, the governor, after whom a famous school has been named, who didn't want them in, and he asked the West India Company, should we let them in or not? They said yes. And so he fired off an angry letter saying, I warn you, now that we let in the Jews, we're going to have to let in Lutherans and Papists too. Now, what does this tell me? This is a great country of equal opportunity racism, whereas everywhere else, Jews were the single target of hatred and resentment, like throughout Europe. Equal opportunity racism sounds mean, but it gives you some cover. You're not the only target. Point two, as we all learned in our civics classes, is Jefferson's wall of separation between state and church and the First Amendment. Nowhere else did you have that in the Western world. You always had a state religion, and that state religion was inimical to the Jews. And finally, if you go back to the origins of the United States, it really dramatizes the exceptionalism of the country. What were the Puritans all about? Unlike the Lutherans and everybody else, they rediscovered the roots of their faith in the Hebrew Bible. And so they were going to build a city upon a hill. The God of Israel is among us, said John Winthrop. Hardly was a country founded when Washington visited the synagogue in Truro. The Kaiser never did. And so given these three features that truly make America different, I would conclude that these are very strong foundations that make America different and which assure, in the end, a benign future for the Jews. Now we can talk about the dark side, but that's my triple reason in favor of American exceptionalism, which ended up with a country that the Jews never had.
Well, let me challenge you. I mean, I'll challenge you on one thing,
Okay.
and I'd like to hear your response, Joe. The more important even than Jefferson's wall of separation or the roots in Hebrew Bible or the equal opportunity bigotries.
Bigotry, that's the word, bigotry.
Was in Europe, Jewish success met with the envy of the mainstream. In the United States, Jewish success met with the admiration of the mainstream.
Absolutely.
Because thanks to the Calvinism of those Puritan forefathers, worldly success was a sign of divine favor. And that meant that for Jews in the United States, their talent would not be turned against them. Their success would not be turned against them. Their achievements would not be turned against them. They would be celebrated and admired and emulated. People would look to the Jews and say, what a good thing that they've done so well, how well it reflects on us, as opposed to look at those people, what are they taking away from us, which seems to be sort of the history of a lot of European anti-Semitism, especially where Jews did well, like in Vienna or Berlin or Paris at the turn of the previous century. Now my sense is that that's changing. Our Puritan forefathers, and I say that certainly they're not my literal forefathers. My forefathers came from Vilna and Kishinev. They are
Calvinist strongholds.
Yeah, but it's funny. I mean, as an American, you talk about our Puritan forefathers, right? And I have no lineage with them, but I feel a kinship. But they're no longer in favor. They're now seen as genocidaires who killed off the Indians who had received them and celebrated a first Thanksgiving with. Success in America is now being seen as a function of privilege and unmerited privilege. We have, for lack of a better term, a kind of a new religion in the United States called the woke religion. And the last aspect I would add is that the kind of the spirit of intellectual independence, which has always distinguished Jews and gave them a kind of a place, an honored place in the liberal America of the 20th century, is now looked on with disfavor on American. I mean, and you know this as someone who's taught at all the elite American schools, or most of them. It's no longer quite as celebrated to be a contrarian as it used to be. So why should these trends not be more powerful than the history that you're describing? Why does history win out, do you think?
Hey, it's always easier to speculate about what was than what will be. You know that, right? Soothsaying prophecy is not given to ordinary mortals. But in a way, you gave me a fourth pillar, what you just said.
Okay.
To my adding another one to my three, which is, and that's important to stress. This society or this culture was built on achievement. People came here to make it, to hustle, to make a buck, to rise, to go out, conquer the West, and all that kind of stuff. It's baked into the American character. And that, of course, did favor the Jews. Who are they? I mean, the tradition of intellectualism, of gainsaying, of questioning, of attacking received notions, etc. It was just what you said, just set up the right environment for Jews to flourish. That's the fourth pillar. Now, I agree with you. The downside that you just mentioned is that the American, call it the American creed or faith, is now being sorely tested, not overturned. It's being sorely tested by what you call the religion of wokeism, which sees achievement not as praiseworthy, but as unearned privilege. And therefore, the new dispensation, which wants to distribute status and power and income, not by individual achievement, but by group features, be it skin color or ethnicity and so on. That is the underlying stream that is truly, or philosophical, if you wish, that is truly threatening the Jewish existence, in the sense that it's threatening what, if I may use that word, what made Jews great. And you ask me, well, what's going to happen? I think that this is a kind of Mishuggahs which will not last. It cannot last, because, if you wish, it's kind of anti-American. It runs against the grain of everything this country is and has become. When will it happen? Well, we see some, as you know, the election returns in November show a tide that's turning. And all I can say is, I think it's going to keep turning, because a nation cannot live by this craziness. Not the American nation. Okay.
Any nation. Annika, I just want to turn to you, because I do want us to make sure that we get the people who are listening to ask their questions. But one last question to you before we turn to the audience itself. There is, I think, in Europe, having lived there in 3 separate countries, if you consider Britain Europe still, I don't know if you do, there is visible political exhaustion with the transnational project, with the idea of transcending the concept of community, of a certain kind of nation state ideal. And at least a few Europeans I know, when they look at a kind of a successful model of a nation state, Israel actually looks pretty good, right? There is a grudging kind of admiration, even among people who were committed, and I'm not just talking about Jews, but maybe among European elites who for a long time were committed to the European project, to the post-national, as Joe wrote in one of his books, the post-democratic project of Europe, a new kind of respect. I remember once meeting a very illustrious French journalist, very secular but Jewish, who told me quite proudly that he had never visited Israel. And I said, well, why don't you go? And he said, well, I'm afraid I might like it. Which was a wonderful.
Was it? Hey, Bret, who was it?
A wonderful moment. So, do you ever encounter this? Have some seeds been embedded in the soil that you think might transform European thinking on questions like the Jewish question, and what Jews might in fact be able to teach the largely failing states, or not entirely successful states, of the European Union?
Well, okay. So what I will say, well, you mentioned the sorrowful wife in my the name of my essay, and I guess what I'm a bit tired of is the idea that we have to teach them or convince them of anything, right? So maybe I'm a tired and petulant European Jew in that sense. I believe, of course, I see many examples of Swedes and around Europe, people that admire Israel greatly. Most of them, to be honest, are the people that I get along with in Sweden are either like true faith Christians or honestly truth faith Muslim religious people, because the true taboo in Sweden is still religion. So it's something we bond over, those of us who have strange, peculiar lives based on religious habits and faith. And there is admiration for Israel, but I'm afraid that what I feel strongly, and I felt it the strongest now in the latest Gaza war, I was exhausted because you have a recurring realization that it doesn't matter what we do, the hatred of Jews is just eternal. We can have this conversation over and over again, but I guess the reason I'm petulant is because I learned the hard way as a teen in Sweden that it doesn't matter how I look, what I say, how I hide my Judaism, whatever it might be, it won't make anybody hate me any less, right? So the only way forward is the shtetl way, in my personal opinion, or the aggressively Jewish, if you will, the proudly Jewish way. Because yes, there is debate about Israel, about the Jewish issue, whatever it might be, but Europe's complicated relationship to Jews is old and eternal, in the sense that we will have this conversation over and over again. But the one thing that won't change and should not change is how we act and how we react to it. And as I mentioned in my book and in my essay, and in the example of the 2 weddings that I went to in just a matter of a couple of weeks, is that we just need to keep doing the same thing. Because we should stop relating to the outside world. And I know it's not a very woke or modern or whatever it might be, even friendly attitude towards this issue, but the reason we are here today, the reason that, God willing, we will have Jewish grandchildren, is because we keep doing the same thing that people have been doing for thousands of years. So the problem in this relationship with Europe is that I and my friends and basically everyone I know and relate to Europe less and less. We are less willing to interact with the outside society because there's no reciprocity in that relationship. And we've learned that, our parents learned that, our grandparents learned that, and each of us learned it the hard way, unfortunately. So I am less and less willing to relate to them, not in a aggressive way, but I keep myself to myself, because the main lesson here is that it doesn't matter what we do, so we might as well be proudly Jewish. So how people feel about Israel or us it's becoming less and less important to me. And I expressed it in my piece as well, that the loss is, I no longer feel it's ours. I do feel that it's Europe's loss, because we could have taught them a lot when it comes to peoplehood, identity, strength, because we represent all of those things. But I do not think that they are willing or open to learning that lesson with us and from us.
Let me now turn to our audience that I think has been patiently waiting to get their questions in. Jeff Herf, my friend at the University of Maryland, has a long one. Let me read it to you. The future of American Jews depends in part on the continued presence of Jewish intellectuals and scholars in our universities. My anecdotal, unscientific impression is that a young generation of American Jews look at what has happened in the universities in recent decades and have concluded that if they are willing to defend the legitimacy of the state of Israel and to speak frankly about anti-Semitism, when it comes from the left or Islamists, they are not welcome in the academy, and that their chances for launching academic careers are slim. I hope I am wrong about this trend, but I wonder if there will be a generation of Jewish intellectuals and scholars comparable to those of the post-World War II era. I'm going to put this question to Joe, because you've taught at Johns Hopkins and at Stanford and at other great universities. So is this your sense that we are losing a generation of would-be great American Jewish intellectuals, that we're not going to get the Lionel Trillings back in the world?
Well, if we withdraw into our communities, into the ghetto behind the high walls, then by definition we can no longer play the role that Jews have played so brilliantly post-French Revolution. They changed the world in any area of human knowledge, from literature to physics. So I also think that it wouldn't be fun if we don't go out in the world and do intellectual combat, but stay at home honoring the 613 commandments. It's not a very variegated experience, I would say. Having said that, I'm afraid that Jews are losing a classic bastion of their success, which is the university. Now, are they being edged out or are they pulling out? I have the sense it's a mark of Jewish success that they no longer have to excel as scientists and thinkers. They can go out there and make a buck. I mean, I've taught at Stanford. Where the Jews go? They go across the street to Sand Hill Road and become VC, venture capitalists, where you make about 20 times more than you make at Stanford. So this is a price of success we are paying. Having said that, I think Jeff Herf is correct. This is no longer a very hospitable place, at least not in the humanities and social sciences. And it's reflected in the fact that if I look at graduate school applications in the so-called soft sciences, Jewish applications are declining. But I want to think, because they can do so much better now outside the university than they could 100 years ago.
This is a question that comes from Jay Meyer, and I think it's for you, Annika. Why are Europeans prepared to give in to Islamists?
It's potentially a long answer, but I'll try. And my personal view is that we have a vacuum of sorts of ideology, of identity. And I will say in the Islamist favor that they do have identity and conviction, something that unfortunately Europe lacks, and in my example, Sweden lacks. And the vacuum longs to be filled. So I would say that it's an absolutely overpowering force for a lot of Western European countries. And then, of course, I'll be a bit, I'll be honest and say that I believe that it's basically, inverted racism, in the sense that a lot of these countries, especially in Nordic countries, are quite racist. I think it's why they make so many excuses, for example, for Palestinian terrorism, because deep down they believe they are brutes and cannot do better. They do not view them as equals.
This is the Swedish view of Palestinians is essentially
they let them
bigotry of soft expectation, of low expectations.
Exactly, 100%. So in that sense, but more than anything, I believe that we had a real loss after World War II. Europe decided to purge itself of everything basically that today, coincidentally, Israel stands for. Religion, national identity, all of these things. So it became the enemy. And then Europe became a void. And Islamists are quick and very efficient in filling that void. And it's a tide that is very difficult to stop. So, but it had fertile ground. Like I always say, it would be very difficult to have anti-Semitism rise in the way that it has in Sweden if it wouldn't be welcome on some level by Swedes themselves. That we cannot blame the Islamists alone. That there's a no smoke without fire kind of attitude from a lot of Western Europe when it comes to Jews, because we know anti-Semitism didn't really start with the Islamists in Europe. Far from it.
Can I say something?
Joe, go ahead.
There's a paradox here. Annika is right in saying that Europe has been denationalizing, losing its identity, thinking transnational and cosmopolitan. But Islamism is the fierce enemy of precisely that. Why would they like or respect or at least protect Islamism that stands against everything they believe in now? This is something I don't understand. And the only answer I can give you is fear. It's fear of a group in their own midst, which has not hesitated, some at least, whose extremes have not hesitated to use violence. Look at Paris, look at any European city. So maybe they should not, given their new ideology of Europe, they shouldn't prefer Islamism, like Islamism. Yet they're protected, and the only explanation I have is fear.
Annika?
Okay, I know we don't have endless amounts of time, but I'd like to just add to that I think that the strength of Jews is the weakness of Europe, meaning that if you're going to fight a strong ideology like Islamism, You have to be able to define yourself. And it's the issue of immigration in Europe at the heart of it. If you're going to somehow not assimilate, but at least immigrate these people into Europe, you have to say, to be Swedish is X, to be
Absolutely.
Norwegian is X.
Yeah.
We don't have that. Large parts of Europe do not have that. We cannot put a finger on what our identity is, what it means to be European today. Very few parts of Europe can do that today. And that's why it's difficult to fight an ideology that is so strong and so easily defines what it is. By the way, yes.
Let me put a question to either one of you or both of you, which is, this seems to me to be intimately tied to what you can call the de-Christianization of Europe. I mean, Europe's identity globally, leaving aside different parochial versions, is that Europe was Christian, right? Europe was Christendom for basically from the time of Constantine right up until the post-war era, and it ceased to be that. So to what extent does the de-Christianization of Europe really kind of explain this phenomenon in your view?
Asking me or asking Joseph?
Joe.
Either. Okay.
No, I think that's a very important insight. De-Christianization is just the right word, and the numbers, the statistics, prove the point every day with people leaving their churches. It still doesn't explain to me why we are so fearful of Islam. I mean, you could still have a secular ideology of liberalism, democracy, transnationalism, which you can hold up against the kind of integral Islamism that the extremes demonstrate. I'm stumped, but I think you're right. If you have no strong beliefs, how can you fight people who have stronger beliefs than you have?
Well, I can give you an answer if I can interject for a second.
Please.
Do you remember Theo van Gogh?
Yes.
The director who made a film and was murdered in the streets of Amsterdam with a knife. And reportedly, his last words were, "Can't we talk about this? Let's be reasonable." And in a sense, this is, I mean, I'll have to go back and make sure that I have that right. But that's what I remember, I think, from the Ian Buruma book about it.
Yeah.
The language of reason is in some ways quite a potent one, but it's one that has more self-skepticism than self-belief, which from the point of view of maintaining strong communities is a mixed bag. I mean, I guess you might say. I want to just turn to a few more questions from the audience. This is from Joe Rosenberg. I think I must know 6 Joe Rosenbergs. I wonder if this is my friend Joe Rosenberg. It's for you, Annika. Joe says that you're a glutton for punishment. People should live where they are wanted. Wherever one lives, they should adhere to the standards of the community. For me, that is America. In America, all groups have the same ground rules. Do you want to respond? It's not a question, but do you want to respond to that? Are you a glutton for punishment, Annika?
Well, in a sense, yes, but that's a deep psychological question. So I'll try and respond in the way that I think he intends the statement. I would say that I believe in living as strangers and neighbors in any society. That I don't believe that I have to adhere. What do you mean by the rules? I'm happy to adhere to the laws of Sweden, but I also believe that the strength of any country is to have very strong individual identities living side by side. And that can only happen if I say, for example, I believe I am absolutely right, which I do in my faith, in my traditions, in my culture. I adhere to the laws, but I'm a Jew first. And I think that's the strength of the society. It's also what I always thought, I spent a lot of time in the US as a kid, and I always admire the US so much because I felt like that is what freedom of religion is there, that you can hold these dual identities. It means that you adhere to the laws of the land, but I can be Jewish American. I can be Sikh American. You know, I can hold these things, and that's so important to us. And that's where Europe has failed greatly, I believe. So am I a glutton for punishment? No, but I do believe in the rights of any person to live freely without persecution anywhere he or she wants.
Let me, just
yeah.
because I'd like to ask the more challenging questions that come from our audience. Someone named Lillian, who appears to be from Stockholm, says, takes you somewhat to task for not living in Sweden anymore, and adds that there's a very nice kosher store in Stockholm, as well as 3 synagogues and a Jewish day school and a federation of Jewish communities in Sweden. So is the picture, I guess the question is, the picture is as dire as the one you paint?
I would say it is. I live half and half, first of all. So I didn't completely go into exile. I work in Ghana. So I'm here for work reasons. But yes, there's a small kosher store, which is lovely, by the way, in the Jewish Community Center. And in order to get into that, we pass through 2 security checks, armed security checks. And do I think that that's a reasonable way to live? No. Do I think it's reasonable to live with the amount of fear that we do? Yes, there's a Jewish day school, which we are struggling with, by the way, every day in order to have true Jewish religious education. We're struggling with the Swedish government on that as we speak, in order to allow religious education in a Jewish school, because it's such a deeply secular country. I think it depends on the amount of observance that you have as a person, depending on how you feel about living as a Jew in Stockholm. The fact that we have a small Jewish store in the Jewish Community Center, it's a wonderful thing, but it's still, kosher slaughter is still outlawed since 1937. And I think that's abhorrent. The fact that there's a bill every single year to outlaw male circumcision, I think is abhorrent. That still happens. And I think that if you ask the more observant Jews in Stockholm what they think about Jewish life, I think they would agree with me.
Let me conclude, because I'm mindful of our audience's time. It's the lunch hour. And I'm going to conclude with a question for you, Joe, because you have lived a life on different continents. Maybe this is too personal, but if you had your druthers, Joe, and your children could live as Jews in Israel, Europe, or the United States, where would you have them be?
Well, the problem is that one of my daughters went to school here, Stanford, and the other one went to Oxford. So that answers half the question. And one of them lives in New York and the other one lives in London. All 3 countries have some wonderful sides. And our daily lives, be it in Berlin or in Washington, is not affected by everything we've been talking about. So maybe Jews ought to stop being Jewish, which means being fearful and nervous. Maybe we should be a little bit more goyish and be more optimistic and equipoise. I mean, this is not the Western world of the 20s and 30s, nor is it Russia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we've got a good thing going, which I'm saying only because this is a nice way to conclude this discussion.
Well, I do remember that I once had a fellowship out at the Hoover Institution in Stanford.
Yeah.
And it was so relaxed and chill, if I can use the word, that I had to leave as soon as possible for New York, because I can only exist as a Jew in a place where I'm as neurotic as possible.
So you like being a neurotic?
I try to lean into who and what I am.
Funny, you don't look neurotic.
Listen, on that note, I want to thank you both for a wonderful discussion. We are trying to do these on a regular basis at SAPIR, which is a new publication from the Maimonides Foundation or fund, I should say. And we will be doing more of these. We seem to have a fairly regular audience. And the point of it is to cultivate important Jewish conversations across political differences, across time zones, across differences in religious observance, to enrich Jewish life and meet the challenges of our time. And I think thanks to you, Joe, thanks to you, Annika, we're getting some way there. So I hope we can have more of these discussions. And to our audience, most of all, I really want to thank you for your continued participation. These things matter. To have engaged and intelligent audiences is a pleasure. And apologies again for the technical delay at the start. So have a wonderful evening, and Chag Sameach. I hope you light candles tonight for the second night of Hanukkah. Take care.
Cheers to our moderator.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye.